It's the 21st of June, the longest day of the year. We are having a lovely warm spell of sunny weather and the dahlias are doing pretty well. In fact, Geoff has already started tying them up. The climbing roses are doing well too. So we are confident that we'll have a good display when we open our garden for charity on the 4th and 5th of September. In this episode, Geoff is going to show you what he does with his pot tubers to get them ready to plant outside. But first he's going to talk about some of the other jobs he's been doing since our last episode.
It's the 10th of June. We've got quite a lot of our pots ready potted up now and starting to look nice. And I've now planted up all the bedding dahlias. And I've also planted out all the salvias and the fuchsias that are kept in the greenhouse over winter. I try to choose varieties of fuchsias and salvias that will provide a nice contrast to the dahlias. They're tall enough to stand up to their own there, so that they won't get swamped by the dahlias. This here is a variety called Royal Bumble, which has been in the ground outside all winter. It's one of the few hardy ones. In the greenhouse I've got quite a few varieties of cosmos growing. Some sweet peas, some zinnias, some lavatera, and I've now planted my marigolds, called a variety called Durango, which is very good. I've only just planted them and they're already coming up. Now you might think that planting marigolds in early June is very late, but it'll work out perfectly for me. I'm pretty confident that they'll be looking great when the dahlias are at the best. Now you might remember me planting seeds of Verbena rigida in the kitchen and leaving them on the windowsill to get started. That was around February time. Well, here they are now. They are a straggly plant. I'll be planting them out at the front of some of the borders in the next week or two. I've also planted some seeds of lobelia, a couple of varieties, contrasting blues. In a week or two they'll need potting on into seed trays before they get planted out. I'm hoping that they'll make it all the way around the garden at the front of each bed. You might remember that in February I bought a couple of plug plants of argyranthemums, yellow argyranthemums, and I've taken some cuttings off them. Here are some that I've already potted up, and here are some more that I've planted into a mixture of sand and compost with a bit of perlite, and they've also taken and are now ready to pot on. If all goes to plan, then the yellow argyranthemums will be put in the middle of the blue Verbena rigida. They grow to the same height, and if it works out, they provide a fantastic colour contrast to each other. In February I bought some nemesia plants, different varieties of nemesia, and I took some cuttings of them and grew them in the kitchen on the windowsill. These are what I've got from those cuttings. They've done quite well and are now ready to plant out. Some of them are already in some of the tubs that we grow, but I'm going to plant some of them into the ground. In our biggest border, in front of the green fence, as well as tall growing varieties of dahlia, I've planted some dwarf ones here, as I mentioned before. Now in the middle I've left gaps to put other plants to contrast with the dahlias, and that's where I'm going to plant some of the nemesias. Now I've never tried the nemesias in the ground before, so it's going to be an interesting experiment. I'm always on the lookout for new types of plant that will be looking good in September time when the dahlias are at the best. Nemesias appear to be a type of plant that keep on flowering and flowering all through the summer, and they're also reasonably simple to overwinter in the greenhouse, so they look like an ideal plant for me. We'll see. As I plant the Nemesias out, I like to give them a little bit of compost, just like the Dahlias. Here the compost is in the hole. I couldn't keep the camera still to show you how I did it. And there it is, planted up. It's a variety called Wisley Vanilla. It's a lovely white flower, but the great thing about it is it actually smells like vanilla ice cream. It's absolutely beautiful smell, and it's a strong smell as well, so I'd really recommend that variety. It keeps flowering for ages. Though it'll be a while before the dahlias start flowering, there are some flowers in the garden that are already in bloom. This is a rose, a climbing rose called Ferdinand Pichard, which is an old English variety. It smells just like Turkish Delight, beautiful smell. And this climbing rose is called Dublin Bay. It usually has 2 or 3 flushes of flowers. And it's already looking pretty good. Many years ago I saw a beautiful blue viola that I fancied, so I took a few seeds off it. They've been growing for me ever since. I must admit, sometimes I get fed up with them and try to eradicate them, but they keep coming back, and at the moment they look lovely. Here's the salvia plant that I mentioned earlier, called Royal Bumble. These red flowers, they'll keep on going for the rest of the summer. It's a fabulous plant. This is a variety of coprosma called Pina Colada. Beautiful colours. I bought it a couple of years ago, and I think it's supposed to be semi-hardy, but I dug it up and kept it in the greenhouse over winter. Last summer I managed to get a couple of cuttings off it, quite easily really. Here's cutting number 1. Here's number 2, which is in full sun. Not sure that it likes the full sun because this one doesn't look quite as good. Another coprosma, a darker one. My son brought me this for my birthday. I just hope it doesn't grow too tall and mask out the dahlias behind them. Here's a small area of the garden where I've planted lots of different types of salvias. As with the dahlias, the plan is that the tall ones are growing at the back and the short ones at the front. I'll keep you posted whether or not it works. Now, although I've already planted up most of my dahlias, as you can see, I've kept quite a few spares. I try to keep at least 1 spare of each height, just in case. Even though most of the dahlias have now been in the ground at least a couple of weeks, sometimes you find that some suddenly stop growing, and you can't create a perfect effect if not every one of them is growing properly, so I have to make sure I've got a spare to replace anything that goes wrong. So here's one I found that wasn't doing well. As you can see, it's not producing any roots, it's just still living on the tuber. So I took one out of the greenhouse and replaced it, and here it is, tied up neatly. Once I'm confident that all the ones in the ground are growing well, I'm still left with a few, and I'm left wondering what to do with them. Quite often I dodge them in the soil somewhere where there's a little spare patch. Others I give to friends. But the other thing you can sometimes do with a spare plant is to turn it into a pot tuber. This is a plant called Westerton Harry. It's a really good variety and I want to keep it. I've pulled back the soil a little bit from the crown where the crown meets the tuber, and as you can see it's sending out a couple of white roots there. In effect, this plant is no different from a plant that's been grown as a cutting. It's got its own shoot, it's got its own roots and some green leaves, and if I remove that old tuber, then there's no reason why that plant shouldn't thrive as a pot tuber. So I've now cut away the old tuber, removed the bottom pair of leaves, and I can now pot that up like I would any other pot tuber. So I've now potted it up. I've taken off parts of the leaves to try to reduce transpiration so that it doesn't flop, and I'll give it plenty of water before I then keep it under the greenhouse staging out of direct sunlight for a couple of days so that the roots have more time to develop before I plant it on with the rest of the pot tubers outside. And with a bit of luck, that'll make a good plant next year. Similarly with this one, I've got plenty of this variety. I don't want any more into the ground, but as you can see, there's a new white tuber started there already. So I can just chop off the old one and that plant will do nicely as a pot tuber. By the way, the reason I get rid of the old mother tuber is because over the time it would rot, and if it's stuck in a plant pot, the pot with the rest of the plant, then it might spread rot to that, so it's best to get rid of it at this stage. Most mother tubers do rot over summer, so that the majority of the tubers will be brand new ones. As I will show you at the end of the season, if the mother tuber has survived on a plant that's been grown in the ground, then it's best to chop it off so that it doesn't rot over winter and cause havoc in the storage area. So there it is, potted up and watered, excess foliage removed. I'll keep this underneath the staging out of full sun until it's acclimatised, and then it'll be put out with the rest of the pot tubers. I haven't seen a moth as big as this one before in the garden. Hope it doesn't eat dahlias. And finally folks, this, barring unexpected fatalities, is the last dahlia that I'm going to plant into the soil this year. All the gaps have been filled and this is the last one. It's tempting to plant them out when they're a little bit small, but I've found that it's better to leave them in the greenhouse until they're bigger. That way they're less likely to get blown about and they're also less likely to be eaten by the slugs. It's also easier to keep them watered in the greenhouse. It's the 14th of June. I'm pretty sure that if I check my records I'll find that I completed the task about a week earlier last year. But we had a pretty cold and wet spring. Just hope that the summer brings better weather so that they all catch up in time for when we open the garden for charity on the first week in September. Though weeding's not my favourite job, I do try to keep on top of things, and during this current warm spell I've been hoeing so all the paths are now weed and grass free. I just hoe the weeds out of the ground and leave the sun to do the killing. Right, it's the 14th of June and at last I've got enough room in the greenhouse to start doing the pot tubers, getting them potted up. At the moment they're all still in little trays underneath the greenhouse staging. As you can see, some of them are getting what you might call a little bit leggy. There are 12 plants there. Now each plant is going to get its own pot, and I use these square ones. They're about 3.5 to 4 inches diameter. I've found that if you use square ones, the roots don't wrap around themselves and squeeze themselves to death. Now I know that some gardeners who grow pot tubers use larger pots than these, but these seem to work for me, so why change? Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos about pot tubers, I don't feed them. The idea is to convince the plant that it's about to die, and you don't let it flower, so the only way it's going to reproduce itself is to make sure that it grows a tuber. But having said that, last year I made use of something called a mycorrhizal fungus, which helps stimulate root growth. And I did find that the tubers were slightly bigger than normal, and more of them had actually produced a tuber, so I'm going to give it another go. You just put a little handful into the potting compost, mix it up, and there you go. So here's the first one I'm going to pot up. It's a little plant of a variety called Rycroft Rebel, and as you can see it's already producing a small tuber, and when I plant it up into a bigger pot, that tuber will get bigger. So there it is, potted up, and note that I've already taken out the growth point. I'll aim to keep this plant on the short side. You don't want it producing lots of laterals that then produce flowers. You want to make it concentrate its efforts into the tuber. This is a variety called Hillcrest Firecrest. It really does have a very pretty flower. I've tried growing it a couple of times, but I've lost it both times because it doesn't produce much of a tuber. So this year I've bought 2 plants of hillcrest, firecrest. One I'm growing in the garden, the other I'm growing as a pot tuber. I'm hoping that even if the one in the garden doesn't produce a tuber, this one will. Now you might recall how in a previous video I bemoaned the fact that I'm down to my last plant of Westertonella Grace and that I couldn't get a cutting off it. I was worried that this year was going to be my last time growing that variety. Fortunately, a friend of mine has given me a couple of plants. Now, rather than grow them in the ground, even though that was tempting, I've decided that the best thing to do is to just keep growing them in a pot as a pot tuber, so that next year I'll definitely have more than one plant available. So there they are, all potted up, all 225 of them. The tall ones on the right here will be planted out into the ground in the next couple of weeks, whereas these shorter ones might need to stay in the greenhouse for a little bit longer to develop. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm hoping that each of these plants will produce a small tuber which will overwinter in the greenhouse better than the field tubers at the bottom of the ones that are out in the ground at the moment. And this is particularly useful for those varieties that don't tend to produce a good tuber. They're more likely to produce a decent pot tuber than they are a decent field tuber. Now, just another word about potting compost. In a previous episode I told you that I always bought the cheapest because they were more or less all the same. Well, I'm afraid that's probably no longer true. In Britain they've banned the use of peat in potting compost, so they're having to find alternative sources. I've used several types this year and they all seem to be made from recycled material. Now that would be fine, but some of them are very coarse and contain twigs and big lumps of wood. And I was particularly disgusted by a brand that's very, very famous. I won't name it in fear of getting sued, but it looked more like the contents of a vacuum cleaner than something that you'd want to try to grow plants in. Now don't get me wrong, I can't say that any of these brands of compost caused any problems for my dahlias, which have got large roots and tubers, etc. But we had lots of problems with little plants like these lobelias, where it was very difficult to get the plants into the soil and get any actual material around the roots. So next year it looks like I'm going to have to pay a bit more to find some that's been more carefully desiccated. Now that's a big word, isn't it? And now you're privileged to catch sight of Heather doing her favourite job, potting up lobelia. I'm actually growing 2 different types of lobelia. There's a dark blue variety called Crystal Palace and there's a lighter blue one called Cambridge Blue. The idea is to have a dark blue, light blue combination across the whole of the borders, at front of the borders all the way around the garden. Behind them I'm planning to have marigolds. There's a variety I grow called Durango, which I reckon is the best on the market. It's expensive anyway, so it should be good. Fortunately, I think I've grown enough Durango to have enough to go all the way around the garden at the front, so that if the lobelia were to fail, I wouldn't be left with a blank space. One place I haven't grown any dahlias is behind the asters, called Munch. Last year the asters overwhelmed the rudbeckias in front and the dahlias behind them, so this year I'm going to have to think of something else to grow there instead of the dahlias. Now I might fill the gap behind the asters with some cosmos. I've grown a few of 3 different types. They do tend to grow quite tall, so they should be tall enough to hold their own against the asters. The alternative to those at Cosmos would be some tall growing marigolds that I grow. I've been growing for several years a variety called Harlequin, which is a red and yellow striped one which grows to about 3 foot tall. So that would suffice if I decide that the Cosmos are not going to be up to the job. I'll decide later. It would be worth subscribing to my channel so that you could see in an exciting next episode which option I've gone for. Now, At this time of year you need to be on the lookout for black fly which attack the growing points of your dahlias. If you see an ant on your dahlia, there's a fair chance there is some black fly around because ants farm black fly. So I decided I better use my SB plant invigorator, which I've talked about before, and went out at 9 o'clock at night when all the bees were in bed and all the wasps were cozied up with the queens, and sprayed the growing points of all the dahlias. It's not the most exciting job, but it's a very useful one at this time of the year. If you let black fly continue, they'll cause havoc, they'll weaken the plant, but more probably they will also spread viruses between plants because they move from one plant to the other. So it's best to be rid of black fly as soon as you can. As Heather mentioned in the introduction, I've already started having to tie the dahlias up. That's quite unusual for June. You don't usually have to start tying anything up until July, but because of the summer, the warm spell, things have been growing quite quickly. Now when I tie them up, I try to make sure that I don't tie them plants too tightly, so that there's flexibility, so that if extra branches grow, there's room to put them. And also you don't want to strangle the plant because the stalk gets wider as the year goes by. So as you can see in this next example, here's a plant that's been tied up for a few days, and in the meantime an extra lateral has grown a bit taller and wants pushing in, and there's enough room there to be able to do that. Though we've been having quite a long dry spell, I do try to avoid watering them too often. As you may have seen, when I planted them out, I put a full spadeful of compost under each plant. That should retain the moisture and it encourages the roots to go down into the soil, whereas if I kept watering them, the roots would have no incentive to go any deeper. One of the top exhibition growers in the country, who grows his dahlias on an allotment, has told me that he's got no water on his allotment. There is no artificial water source. So he doesn't water it at all the whole summer, and he wins competitions many times. So in the main I only water a dahlia if it looks as though it's flagging. That's it for now, folks. Hope to have something interesting to show you in a couple of weeks' time. In the meantime, there's a little job that I've been putting off.